So today we're going to talk about APIs and how large and ungainly they are. But before that, has anyone here heard of Fauve Matisse? Fauve Matisse, not ringing any bells. All right, this is some graphic art software from the early 90s. And they're sort of like the Zero Park of graphic art software in that they had some amazing features. I think Fauve Matisse later became X-Res, later became Macromedia, Fire. Someone help me out. Fire. Ugh. But one of their features, one could argue, is the billion-dollar feature. So last I checked, Adobe's market cap was at $139 billion, give or take, and that's not their peak. Creative Cloud and the tools are all built around, sharing these files. And those files, those Photoshop files, are based on this feature. So the feature I'm looking at allows for non-destructive updates. If you were to share a file and you had some text in the top right, and I would say, here's my pamphlet, please edit the text, and you weren't able to edit the text, that would have been a destructive update. So any guesses as to what the feature is? Layers, thank you. So 1993 or 4, Photoshop adopted the layers feature from Fauve Matisse. And did it contribute to its success? Most definitely. Photoshop layers. All right, in the interest of being polite, I'm going to cut straight to the chase. Overlays are a YAML document that aim to transform some input document to an output document. So if there's one takeaway of what overlays are, how they're going to fit into your infrastructure or your thinking, this is what they are. This is the mechanics of an overlay document. And we'll get back to some of this stuff for sure. So I'm Josh. I run lead on the Swagger open source at SmartBear. I wrote a book. I have a very easy to Google name because no one else has that last name, which is kind of cool. So I own the .com, and it's very easy to get handles on, and it's only 7 letters. If you haven't already noticed, I love to chat, so come bug me anywhere you see me. This talk, we're gonna look at the other people in API design. I'll get to who the person is, but mostly we're interested in the other people of API design in this talk. And the ones I've listed here are documentation writers, DevOps, product managers, and I'm sure I'm missing many. I think like security and legal are 2 personas that I haven't even properly put a lot of thought into. We're going to look at the mechanics again of overlays, how they work, so that that is something you can take away from this as well. And then we're going to look at I'm going to have fun talking about my ideas around the pitfalls, around some good practices, and around how we think about APIs, in the context of an overlay. So, has anyone here never heard of or never seen a YAML file? Just as like a level setting, right? Okay, that's good because I didn't have any slides to back up what a YAML file is. I'm also going to refer to APIs as a very general word, but I'm talking about OpenAPI files as like a default, and that's just a habit of mine, but async APIs and to some degree even JSON schema, all 3 of which are YAML-based specs, can benefit from overlays in some way. I have no idea why books have this page intentionally left blank, but I felt I needed to get that check mark out there. So before we even continue further, let's start with a quote. API design is no longer the concern of a single person. It has outgrown that. Now, I couldn't find a real quote, so you'll forgive me if I borrowed one from Archimedes, who would have said this had he been around APIs. Some more level setting on APIs, and if we think about the purest form of an OpenAPI file or an API definition, what runs through my head is the shape of the API. And when we look at REST, we can think of the shape as, routing. Where are things? Where must I plug in the variables? And we can look at the shape of the messages flowing through. So what must I give you? What will you give me in return? Now, I'd hope to put in a very old computer, but I think I'm in the wrong audience. I think you guys might have older machines in your repertoire. So this is an API at its heart. And we're actually starting to add more and more context and more information around this. And this is the thing I don't want to talk about today. In SmartBear, we have been inordinately blessed with a number of Barrys, all of which are back-end engineers. And historically, Barrys have been involved in creating these API designs. Whether it's through API design first, whether they're diligent enough, some Barrys are not, or whether it's through code first. But this isn't about them. This is about the other folks. The folks around API design, of which this conference this year has really brought to the forefront. We've been looking at the SIGs as a way of describing these other pieces of information. And we've seen it now even through some of the talks of how important it is to find a home for these other folks. The first one we're going to look into, and one of the primary drivers behind overlays, was documentation. We're looking at the markdown, but we're also extending that into examples. Examples are one of the most underrated and effective ways of communicating documentation. It's one thing to look at a JSON schema and say, yeah, I can see the shape of that. It's another to look at a JSON object and say, oh, I know what that is. Name and email, you don't have to preach on that. I know what that is. And when I want to look into more minutiae, I can. But as a form of communication, examples are underrated. Another driver behind the documentation was translations. We wanted a way of solving the case where you have an OpenAPI file, and again, right, that's just where I default to, and you want to have variations of that for different audiences, specifically around folks who English isn't their first language. And of course, anything that makes it look more Stripe-like is a win, right? Their documentation still is one of the gold standards. So I've broken this down. I like to give names to personas. We can call her Ellen. Any relation to real people is coincidental. But if we think about her as a role in the API design space, we can see what she's responsible for. So Ellen's responsible for documentation and that communication. We can see what she cares about. She cares about accuracy. She cares about developer experience. And of course, she has certain pains. So access to source control is not always there for her. She sometimes, in code-first approaches, would have to go into a Java file and update some annotation so that it spits out an OpenAPI file that looks reasonable. And she would tend to solve this through copy-paste. At some point, she's going to resolve to that. Today we have Xcust there sitting, and they're a gateway or a way of working with Kubernetes. We have the clouds. All of these form into their own persona, their own role around the API space. The point at which we want to get this API out there into the world, we want people to access it. And beyond the vendor extensions for the different gateways, we have things that are more instance-based, like security and the actual location of this API. One pet peeve I have with servers being a list of things is you're telling me these are all the different places this API could be, but I don't know where this API is. Often the versions of the API are different. You're showing me something that is only in dev, and I want to know what's in production. We can call him Nathan. And his responsibilities are deployments, gateways, infrastructure, the places where these APIs will live. As we know, he cares about security, although that's becoming its own role too, where someone with a security mindset will look at this and say, you know what, Josh, that API does not look so great. How Nathan solves his problems varies. There are cases where, sure, we have to overload the OpenAPI file. We have to throw all those extensions in there. More often than not, it's not even in or related to the API, and it's a manual process of going through that UI or using a CLI tool to configure the infrastructure. And when the API changes, someone's going to have to notify Nathan that, yeah, there's some infrastructure changes, and we'll write you an email, we'll stick up a Confluence page. If Nathan really feels empowered, he might do some scripting on the API in order to get it there. Xinternal is a popular use case. So we often have an API that, well, some bits of it I don't really want exposed. And some, I want to go out into the public. And a common way of doing this today is to put a little vendor extension to say, xinternal true. And there are tools out there that will respect this particular vendor extension and filter it out. By the way, do you know what the difference between a nudist and a software engineer is? Nothing. They're both happy to expose everything. Unlike our product manager, which we'll call them Jim, she's interested, or they're interested in the customers, the market. Effectively, they're interested in curation. How can we take a whole API portfolio and curate that to our partners and to the public in general? And her pain is that commitment. If you expose something in any way, it's going to be committed to, and you're now locked in. Whether that's intentionally, and you're happy with that decision, or intentionally where, well, you're going to break those customers and they're going to start shouting. What this leaves us to is that there are a lot of concerns on API design. And it's no longer just Barry who's in charge of or who's responsible for all of these different concerns. And there are more and more roles, more and more personas who are trying to get their 10 cents into the API, which is a good thing. But where do they all fit? And how do we unblock them? So if you're at this talk, you might have a guess as to where we're going. But we are coming with a type of solution to start getting close to this. And we're looking at overlays. It would have been more fun to perhaps call them layers, and just cut to the chase, but overlays is a little bit more Googleable, so that helps as well. And again, in the interest of cutting straight to it, this is a valid and complete overlay document. We'll rebuild this shortly to get you familiar with these pieces, mostly to give you some coverage of what goes in there and how they'd actually be used in practice. There is one key abstraction to overlays. There is a target and there is a mutation. So we want to target some things, some parts of the document, and then we want to do something with them. That is the key abstraction behind an overlay. And one overlay document can have several of these. They're called actions. and together they form an overlay. So target, a mutation. The document itself has some boilerplate. The boilerplate being spec and info object, stuff we should be more or less familiar with coming from OpenAPI or async API. It also has the extend keyword, which we'll look at, and then it has these list of actions, these layers. So let's rebuild this document. We'll start with overlays 100. So that's the YAML way of declaring what we're talking about, what this document is. We'll add in some boilerplate. So we've got a title. We can communicate this document. We have a version. We love versions. And then we have the extends keyword. So now we're getting to a little bit of, all right, okay, how's this going? So here's the Pet Store 3 version. It makes a change from Pet Store Swagger 2. We're spicing things up. We're on 3.0 there. And so that's going to act as the source, the base layer in our Photoshop stack. And then we're going to have the actions keyword, and that's an array. And we're going to look at these actions now in a bit. So within an action object, we have this target keyword. So that's the thing. We want to target some things, and we'll see how to do that. And then the spec currently supports two types of mutations. We have an update and we have a remove. The current standard, and we did argue this, for targeting is JSONPath. So JSONPath was an idea, but it had one major flaw in that it delegated expressions to the underlying implementation. And what does that mean? Well, it's no longer portable. But there is an active effort today by the IETF to standardize JSONPath to address those problems of the expression. And its design goals of targeting things lines up perfectly with overlays. So alternatives to that were JMESPath, also interesting, JMESPath. But JMESPath introduced a few others, and if you are interested in the minutiae, you come argue with us on the overlays channel. We're currently on JSONPath. Here are some examples. So you see we start with $. We separate out the tree structure with some full stops. So the top one, we're targeting one specific thing, which is perfectly valid. So there would be an equivalent JSON pointer to that. But of course, this is a query language. We may want to target more things, so we have wildcards. So the second example would target every operation within an OpenAPI file. And then to become even more interesting, and this is where the standards are arguing most intently to figure out how to get that just right, we have filters and expressions. The filter being saying, well, of this array, I just want to choose some. And the expression being, how do I decide which element I want to choose? So this example, root level tags, and we're looking one with a name that equates to pet. And as a little extra feature in JSONPath, we have all descendants. So 2 dots means look for every description you can find. On the mutation side of this, update is a merge. So here we have a common use case. We want to merge in some documentation to somewhere, I don't know where. We've got a summary and a description, so that data is going to be merged in to some base. And then, well, removes it. So we won't go too much into that. Together, when we look at them as a single action, we'd have them as siblings. So target and update are on the same level. And you see we're updating a summary. And that brings us full circle into, well, this is an overlay document. We have the boilerplate up top. We have some base layer, some document we're targeting, which is very interesting because instead of targeting nothing at all, this document is a source of truth now. Because if I give you this document, you have all the information you need to look at what I was trying to communicate to you. And then on the actions, we have the the meat of this, like what are we trying to do with this document? And in this case, we're saying, I want to update the summary of the post-pet operation within this. Congratulations. You are now overlay experts. There has never been this congregation of overlay experts ever. We saw that there's queries in JSONPath which allow for broad-based querying, allow for doing modifications broadly. More often, though, you'll look at the specific cases of I want to target one specific thing, but you do have the option, and there are use cases for both. And what overlays now become are a tool to extract things out of your API files into their own layers, or more specifically, their own concerns. Some examples of where this could be used is translations, is instantiating your API. So your DevOps or your infrastructure team will have an overlay document, takes in a base API and says, this is where it lives. And they can then communicate that to the teams who need to consume it. Gateways can sometimes have security that comes on top of your API. And where do you describe that security? Either it's a bespoke API definition, or you can layer it in. And of course, that use case of this is public, this is private, this is only for partners, you have the ability to filter out pieces of your document. The benefit of an overlay is that if your underlying document does change, your overlay may not need to. And so if it's part of a pipeline, it's possible to keep that pipeline and to manage your overlays separately to it. So some of the fun stuff now. Now I get to force my ideas and thinking on you. Now that hopefully we've covered some of the who the people we were interested in. So everyone but Barry. How overlays, the mechanics of them, what they are, how they could be used in examples. And now we're going to start to play with those ideas. This is really an excuse to put my dogs on a massive slide. To the left we have Bowser, and to the right we have Blossom. The fact that Blossom is not called Peach haunts me to this day. Bowser being a Mario Brothers turtle thing. But what I'd like to challenge you, or I'd like to put a thought experiment in your head, is how you think about APIs. Phrased differently, would you give your nephew a puppy? When we think about APIs as pets, they are real, and we are trying to describe every detail of this service, its security, all of its operations, all of its dogs poop, if no one knew that. And that can be a lot. Or if you think about toys, which capture some of the essence of the API, some of it, just enough to satisfy your nephew on his 5th birthday, which is different from having them adopt a dog and losing all contact with your brother. So why are we talking about dogs and pets? Oh, let me rephrase. What is the toy in this instance? Well, that's for the consumer. So whereas the pet here is we're describing the producer, we're describing the service in all its detail. When we think about the consumer, that's going to be a subset. That's going to be something else. And that consumer may change. And the context may change. And so we could have one service with many APIs. This variation proliferation. I think this is a good thing, but the assumption that I want related to overlays is that there's going to be a lot more need for API variations in how we think about as we shift over from the producer side more towards the consumer. So why are overlays a standard? Do we really want another standard? And to answer that question, it's one of the design goals is that these documents are first-class citizens. It means we want them to persist. We want someone to own this document. And for that to happen, we want many tools to be able to understand what an overlay document is. So when Lorinda spoke about, where do we see tooling in the SIGs, on overlays, we're very interested on it because we want to keep overlays as simple as possible to encourage that adoption so that these documents can live out there and it's not just part of your pipeline where some tool takes that input and produces some output. These documents are loved. And so that's one of the reasons we look at standardizing this beyond the general health of it so that folks who are interested can look at the design of it and challenge it on that and not on the tooling implementation. This API concerns and the more and more that are added are a good thing. They're either talked about implicitly in different rooms, or we can talk about them on the API. But that doesn't mean it needs to be in that document. The APIs act as a platform with which we can communicate. That was at its heart, it is a communication tool. Here is a method, here is an operation that I want to talk to you about. I want to tell you that its response looks like this, or that if you want to use it, you have to give me these inputs. And that's now growing beyond the shape of the API and into these other concerns: legal, security, infrastructure, code annotations, code gen. And hopefully overlays can help see that we can have both. We can have many concerns, and we can still have a document that's not going to break your Chrome browser. This step was recently fixed, but leading up to my office, there's a reason it's differently colored. There are pitfalls to overlays. And I'm going to run through a few quickly. Invalid definitions. So when we looked at overlays, that first slide, we're talking about YAML, nothing API specific. And so what you could be tempted to do is rip out chunks just to get the byte size down. This is bad. The top document is invalid. Why? Because it's missing an info object. And that invalid document isn't very useful. You can't put it through tooling. Validation's going to blow up on it. So overlays are not meant to break them up on those lines. Another line we can consider, and this is perhaps more what Josh thinks, and we can argue about this for a bit, but are incomplete APIs. So when we looked at Barry and the shape of that API, we wanted to describe the shape, and we want it to be complete in the sense that I do have all the parameters that you're going to need documented here. And it is possible, again, given the YAML nature of overlays, to take out parameters or to try to automate some of your OpenAPI and async API authoring. And one area this pops up is in traits. Async API has this feature, and for those not familiar, a trait is a group of reusable objects. Whereas in OpenAPI, we can only reference one component at a time. Traits will allow us to reference multiple. You can use overlays to get this done for you today. But in doing so, you've just added another moving part. Because now, in order to understand the shape of your API, your consumers have to use the overlay, or you have to have that final artifact at the end of it. And so without overlays, you're not actually sure what this API does. Does it really describe a 400? Those pagination query parameters, I don't know where they are. So this is subjective, but incomplete APIs shouldn't be the line at which we start to slice concerns out of an OpenAPI or async API. More on the negative train of thought. The semantic whack-a-mole of JSONPath. Does anyone here use spectral or specky? I'd say half the audience. If you've used this, or if you haven't, they use JSONPath as well to target elements of a document. And that's great, right? It's accessible, straightforward, but it's not semantic. And what that leads us is to where OpenAPI and async API, there are multiple ways of describing your API. The example I have here is of parameters. You can put parameters under the endpoint directly, and so that'll apply to all the operations. Or you can put them under the operations. But we don't often consider the former, and so our JSON paths don't target them. And they get missed, whether that's through linting or now, whether that's through overlays. So semantic whack-a-mole does exist, and we do need to make sure we account for it when dealing with JSONPath. Do you need overlays? Like any tool in your toolbox, there will be a time you may need it, but start with no. It is another moving part. It does require some small learning curve of what these things are. So if you can get by, if you are running a pet store and your API definition doesn't grow too large, don't use overlays. But as it starts to grow, as you start to involve more people in your API design process, people with different concerns, then consider it. Here are some questions you may ask if overlays make sense to you. The concerns being my favorite one. Do you need variations of the API being another? That's where the documentation and translation and public-private comes in. Some cases it might even be technical. So traffic inference is exciting. That can generate a spec for you. Do you want to use it? If so, that you're not going to change traffic in order to generate a new spec. So you may want to overlay it. More commonly, though, we'll see code annotations and code-first approaches so that there's no more copy-paste. There are alternatives. I think Reed Dockley's command line tool touches on two, at least, of these use cases. One being the adding of documentation, right? So if you want to override a description. And the second was that X internal flag. I want to filter those things out. JSONPath is quite an interesting project. That's the screenshot on the right there. And that's a sort of templating language with self-reference and a type of function syntax. Really cool. But there's a lot of edge cases. And getting your API teams to start using that might be a challenge. And you may have to have a lot more concern about, am I going to brick my disk because I've got a lull bomb self-referencing itself to death? And a shout out to Geneva, which is sort of the in-between, powerful like JSONPath, template language, but still written in YAML, so you can use your parsers. And it has function support. Keep in mind, one of the design goals of overlays is to be accessible by tooling. So when we start introducing functions, that opens up a Pandora's box of what could go wrong and how things might change between one implementation and the next. The SIG meets bi-weekly, and thankfully in this conference we're able to talk more about that. We need your help. We can scratch our own itch, that's not a problem, but we do want a standard that others can benefit from and that we can start to see the other types of innovation around this. So this is being managed besides Slack, which I don't have a link in here, but we can get it to anyone who needs, on GitHub, either through discussions or through the spec itself, through issues. And there is a prototype, so you can use this today. It is spec compliant for that whole spec. And quick thanks to the folks who helped hone this talk. I really appreciated the feedback. It would have been a very different talk with far less dogs in it. And that's the slides on the right. I said I wrote a book. They gave me a discount for today, so if you want 35% off any Manning book, go for it. And then, yeah, slides that you see here are on the QR code to the right. Thank you very much. So I don't know what we are for time, but if we're good, I can take any questions. Eric.
Thanks, Josh. Very interesting and lots of possibilities. The thing I'm really worried about, I think, when I see this, when you said how to use that, basically you said only use it when you have complex needs. And then it seems to me there are a lot of brittleness aspects of this in terms of which order you apply overlays, just syntax changes of the underlying JSON and so forth. So I just think, what's your opinion on how robust this is if you start putting together complex pipelines and scenarios with different places where this is getting processed and still trying to make sure that everybody sees what they're expecting to see?
So I'll just repeat the question is, what are my thoughts on its robustness, how much we can rely on this, given how fragile things like JSONPath or perhaps even the underlying spec changes could impact your overlays? The answer to that is it is fragile, or it could be fragile. As if we are aware of it, that's step number one. But more than that, these problems are being solved in an even more fragile way today. And the validation of that are in tools like Spectral, which does use JSONPath and suffers from the same semantic or lack of semantic context around it. And we are trying to move towards, more robustness, but the value can still be had today, and it can still be relied on with the same sense of design consideration we apply everywhere. If you try to abuse overlays, which is why I try to look at some of the pitfalls there, you will hurt the process. But if you keep it down to the use cases that are critical to your design needs, then you will see the value and you'll be able to use this today. Hopefully that answers some of your question. I see Eric's not entirely satisfied, but we can. Yes.
Something similar to what he asked. It looks like a powerful feature to have, but I was wondering if people are going to abuse it. A couple of things, like people are going to have 10 different overlays, and the sequence of the overlays that you apply matter, right? You change something, the name to Bob, the others one you change it to Frank. The sequence that you apply will change. And what would be the final outcome for that? And because we are thinking about like a single source of truth for the entire topic. Where will people see the single source of truth? And how does the sequence matter?
Okay, so two questions. Similar to Eric's, how solid is it given that order matters when applying overlays? And does this impact source of truth? How do we have source of truth if we have multiple documents? On the orders matters, which is a little more straightforward, yes it does. But if you are trying to separate this out into concerns, you are giving that concern ownership. If you are clashing and overlapping those concerns, then yes, you're clashing and overlapping concerns. If you're trying to update the same documentation field, right? But if you hand over documentation and say this is documentation, you shouldn't suffer so much from order or clashing. And I think that does segue into how is source of truth managed. Now, there is an approach to take overlays and flip it on its head, where you start with Bowser, the Labrador, describing every detail of your API in one file, and then using overlays to filter out the parts that you are uninterested in. But that is one use case. There are still use cases today, like when your source is inaccessible, that, again, trying to speak to Eric's point, where you're doing it in a fragile way today. Let's move towards something more standard on those use cases. So source of truth, you can adopt it where you're lovingly describing your entire API and filtering out parts of it. Overlapping concerns will hurt regardless of how you structure the documents. But giving those concerns a sense of ownership and being well defined about them should remove most of that. Security will be owned by security, infrastructure by infrastructure. And giving that ownership also helps make it more robust, as opposed to overlapping on the same document. Aiden. Last question there, yeah. Mm-hmm. So the question is, do I see a workflow where we use overlays as a tool to create the source of truth, as in the output OpenAPI, and then use that as a source of truth again? That's possible, for sure. In the case of something like traits, where you want to bootstrap that process and say, look, we don't have traits in OpenAPI. I do want to, have some consistency on that. Let's run it through that, but then ignore that source document, and this is our new document. That is a valid case, but I don't see that being the use case for overlays. I see overlays living as their own documents, first-class citizens that apply a concern and are owned by that person or persons who are involved in that concern. Cool. So I think we have to vacate the room, or you don't have to vacate the room. I have to vacate the podium. So thanks again for listening in.